Hi, I'm Dr. Felice Gersh, your integrative OBGYN, here to talk about aging. Well, everyone seems to know what it means to have healthy longevity, to live a very long life with the ability to do whatever you want within limits, even when you're very old, like into your 80s and 90s, that you still have robust health. You can travel, you can learn new things, you can dance, you can have interesting conversations, you could read complex novels and nonfiction, you can follow complex stories in movies. This is part of what we want. This is all of what we want when it comes to healthy aging. We want to maintain our cognitive abilities. We don't want to have pain. We want to maintain our mobility. We want to be able to interpret things, to see, to taste, to laugh, to relate. Well, that gets into the opposite. Not healthy longevity, but talking about aging. So it's inevitable. I talk all the time about menopause. Menopause is inevitable for every woman. So far, I really believe someday that will change, that we'll be able to get a new set of ovaries. But right now, it is inevitable. So what exactly is aging? We kind of know what healthy longevity is, but what is aging? This demon that we always want to combat, which is really like extremely trendy now. There's talk everywhere of longevity. Well, longevity is like the opposite of aging. So what exactly is happening in aging? Well, we're still learning. It's not actually completely understood what this process is. It involves the deterioration of functionality in different ways of cells, so that cells cannot recover and cannot function in the ways that they should when they are younger. And of course, if the cells are not optimally functioning, they have some kind of damage in them that is not repairable. They cannot fix it. And then the tissues that the cells live in will become less functional and healthy. And the creature, the organism, will, of course, then not be optimally healthy and will go into a state of inexorable decline. Aging refers to all animal kingdom and also fungi. So your pets will age, your friends, your family. I know it's kind of sad to think about. You and I are aging as we speak and as we just live our day-to-day lives. So on a cellular basis, there's an accumulation of damage that cannot be repaired. So we're talking, at least not now, we're talking about things like misfolded proteins, DNA damage, RNA changes. So let's talk about it in a little bit bigger sense. Well, what is going on? Well, you don't have the ability, or it's not happening, to have cellular regeneration. For a cell, that is called autophagy. It's like cellular renewal. It's like, I call it spring cleaning, where you take the old structures in a cell and you put it in the lysosome, which I consider like the recycling bin. And from that recycling bin, out comes the basic building blocks, the different molecules, as you break down cellular components, membranes, structures, back to their original components, and then you reassemble them to be like good as new, or reasonably so. And that will enable each cell that can undergo this process of autophagy to live healthier and longer lives. We do not have endless rejuvenation. We do not have endless supply of stem cells. That's why we talk so much about stem cells. Stem cells are like the reserve where these undeveloped potential cells to become the organ cells are living, and these stem cells can be awakened to grow and become the cells that they were destined to be. And then there are some stem cells, like say from a fetus or an embryo or umbilical cord, that have potential to become any type of cell. So it's really amazing, the whole story of stem cells. But we don't, at this time, have unlimited stem cells. And the stem cells we have, we want to stay healthy and rejuvenate them and keep them healthy. Because the reality is, when we run out of stem cells, we cannot replace cells that die. And cells in our body are not immortal. So, for example, bone. Well, cells in bone typically live 7 years, and then a bone cell will die, and it would get replaced by a new bone cell coming from the bone stem cell pool. There are some cells in the body that can live the entire life of yours, like myocardial cells, muscle cells in the heart, some neurons. When I went to medical school, I was told we were born with a certain number of neurons in our brain, and that's it. They could not be replaced. We now know there is such a thing as neurogenesis, but maintained properly, the neurons in our brain could live our entire lifespan, the same with the heart muscle cells. But most cells in our body, they live, they die, and then they get replaced by new cells that are developed from the stem cells. So also, let me talk about for a minute mitochondria. So mitochondria are little structures in cells called organelles, and we won't go into a big deep dive on mitochondria right now, but we'll talk about them another time in terms of more detail. But for right now, suffice it to say that they're like the engine of the cell. They create the energy, but they do more than just that. They also control what is called the cell cycle. So cells, as I mentioned, they should not live forever. Most cells should not. They should die. So when should they die? When they're yucky cells. They're called senescent cells. They're old, they're yucky. Inside they may have this misfolded protein, and when they keep living, they're sometimes called zombie cells. They create a lot of inflammation that can create systemic inflammation that can underlie what is sometimes termed inflammaging, the chronic systemic inflammation that's body-wide. And a lot of it is created by these senescent zombie-type cells. Well, these cells, when they're all yucky, they should die so that they don't create inflammation and potentially become damaged with their DNA from the inflammation, because inflammation will damage the nuclear material, the genetic material, and that can lead to cancer. So these old yucky cells can potentially turn into cancer cells, as well as creating systemic inflammation. So they should pull the plug, kill, die. We don't want these yucky old cells. And it's the mitochondria that control what we call the cell cycle, saying when the cell should rejuvenate or die. And guess what controls that? Well, estradiol is a big modulator of mitochondria in the cell cycle. So we need to keep inflammation down. What damages mitochondria? Some people talk about mitochondrial theory of aging, that basically the damage and degradation of mitochondria underlie the damage to the cells that ultimately lead to cellular senescence, aging, and just the whole process of deterioration with aging. Because when mitochondria become inflamed, then their process of making energy creates oxidative stress as well as energy, and the oxidative stress product is a byproduct of creating energy, and that includes such things as superoxide. When you have a lot of inflammation in the body, then you end up having a lot of problems with oxidative stress, and what that can do is the enzyme that helps to create nitric oxide, which is an antioxidant. It's like a hormone. It keeps everything really healthy. That particular enzyme, called nitric oxide synthase, becomes what we call uncoupled. It doesn't work properly. And one of the components, called tetrahydrobiopterin, it gets oxidized, like equivalent of rusted. And it goes from a 4 tetra to a 2. And it doesn't work properly anymore with the enzyme. It doesn't help the enzyme to do its job to make the really good nitric oxide. Instead, you make superoxide. Now, superoxide is made naturally by all mitochondria in the process of creating energy. It's a byproduct, like a toxic waste product. But when you have inflammation, oxidative stress in the body, then the mitochondria make even more of this superoxide. And the enzyme that converts superoxide to hydrogen peroxide, which ultimately in the cell gets converted into harmless water, it's not working properly. That's manganese superoxide dismutase, which is also modulated by estradiol. And by the way, remember, men make a lot of estradiol. They make it locally. It's converted by the enzyme aromatase from the testosterone that men have. So when I talk about estradiol, of course it refers to women, but often it's referring to men because they make it locally in the tissues. We call it paracrine production. So now we have mitochondria that are producing all this toxic superoxide and some nitric oxide, and the two combine to make an even more poisonous combination product called peroxynitrites. Well, these are going to damage the mitochondria and damage the cell that houses that mitochondria, creating terrible cellular degradation, damage to the nuclear, the DNA material of that cell. That's why a lot of people talk about aging as a mitochondrial degenerative process. And I actually agree in large measure with that, because the mitochondria are like the power factories, the energy centers of cells. But then we have to think, okay, well, what can we do? Well, first we can say what causes like accelerated aging, oxidative stress. Well, quite a few things can. And then we have to talk about how to avoid it. And then another interesting thing I don't want to forget about a very important study that came out not that long ago in the past year from Stanford University on aging. Well, by the way, mitochondria are also capable of rejuvenating, and that we call, not autophagy, that's for the cell, is called mitophagy, for mitochondrial rejuvenation. Also heavily regulated by estradiol. Now, there are a number of things that will accelerate aging, which of course, as much as we can, we want to avoid. These include environmental toxicants. These are chemicals in our environment. They could be in food, they could be in air pollution, very terrible thing. They can be in cleaning products, personal care products, all kinds of products, wrappers that food is in, the different chemicals that are put in processed food. These are toxicants that can create oxidative stress, create free radicals that can create harm to our mitochondria and to our cells, so that the cellular material becomes irreparably damaged, cannot be repaired. How about chronic infections? Yes, chronic viral or bacterial infections, other chronic fungal infections, chronic infections will accelerate the process of aging because they create systemic levels of inflammation. And stress, we know the mechanisms of stress. Stress will downregulate the parasympathetic nervous system so that nothing is working optimally. You're always in a stress state, which means you're going to have vasoconstriction. Your arteries will be more constricted. You're going to retain fluid, more sodium. You're going to have like edema. You're going to have problems in terms of more clotting. Your platelets will aggregate. You're going to lower your gut function, your neurological function. The enteric nervous system is going to slow down, so you're not going to have proper peristalsis. You're going to get impaired gut microbiome, which is a big deal. And then you'll have impaired gut barrier, leaky gut, which leads to more inflammation as the toxicants and the microbes in the gut leak into the body and can circulate and can further hamper the function of the vagus nerves, which the vagus nerve keeps things calm and regulated and so on. So you're going to have hyperstimulation to your heart. This can increase the risk of things like atrial fibrillation, which is definitely an accelerant for aging. And it's so prevalent these days. And some of this can be caused by chronic levels of stress. Of course, chronic infections and chemical toxicants are also creating a form of stress in the body, as is chronic sleep deficiency states. And we know that that's all associated with what? Accelerated brain aging and dementias. Okay, so we definitely want to try to reduce stress. We want to keep chemicals and infectious agents out of our body. The nutritional status you have really is important. And if you have malnutrition, because many people are actually malnourished because they're eating highly processed food that is high in calories and really unfortunate types of fats, and not high enough in important nutrients, antioxidants, polyphenols, and fiber to nourish the gut microbiome. So malnutrition, whether you're ultra thin or ultra overweight, is an accelerant to aging. And I keep talking about estradiol, hormonal imbalances. And it could be beyond just low testosterone, low estradiol, low progesterone. It can be problems with thyroid. There are many other hormones. It could be involving your adrenal hormones. We won't get into all of that. But any kind of hormonal imbalance can accelerate the process of aging. A sedentary lifestyle where you're just sitting all the time. That's why people talk about sitting is the new smoking. I know you've heard that, but it's not fake news, okay? So people who sit a lot will have accelerated aging, which also smokers do, because smoking is a toxicant. So we definitely do not want to sit all the time. And just even, it's so sad, even exercising 1 hour a day, if you're sitting almost the rest of the day, doesn't make up for it. Get up and walk around. I try not to sit much during my day. I try to stand almost all the time. And that's not exercise, but it's better than sitting. Standing is better than sitting. And of course, we do want you to really exercise, so try to have movement plus exercise. And one of the best kinds of exercise, of course, is weight resistance. Now, I'm totally in favor of aerobic exercise. Don't get me wrong. I promote it heavily. But there seems to be some magic in weight resistance. Now, what could that be about? Building muscle. So everything you can do to optimize your muscle mass, your lean body mass, is critical to slow, inexorable aging. And what about mood and loneliness? They've found that, for example, for heart attacks, depression and loneliness are higher risk factors than high cholesterol. So engaging with other people, having a social life, having friends and love and purpose in life is anti-aging. It will slow that inexorable process of aging. But being lonely, being disconnected, having no purpose will accelerate aging. And I'm sure you've heard the stories. There also can be real stories where people retired and within a year they die for no clear reason. What happened? Because their identity was taken away. Their purpose was taken away. And you can retire and do something else, but if you retire and feel you have no purpose in life, every day you get up and you don't even know what you're going to do that's useful, then that is an accelerant to aging. Now, what is very popular now that people are looking at to slow aging? They're called Senolytics. So what are Senolytics? They are molecules, products to try to get cells that are these old yucky cells, the senescent cells, that's where they call them senolytics, to get rid of the senescent cells. Well, I've said this before, I'll say it again. Estradiol is a great senolytic because, as I mentioned, mitochondria control the cell cycle. It's mitochondria that determine when a cell should commit apoptosis, programmed cell suicide. We definitely want every cell, when it's old and yucky, senescent, to die. We don't want them to hang around. No, we don't. So people are looking for molecules, something to take to promote the death of those old yucky zombie cells? Well, exercise is a senolytic, and estradiol is a senolytic, and there are other molecules out there, and maybe we'll do a whole separate talk on just senolytics. But just be aware that that is very trendy now, looking for senolytics. What is also trendy, but also real, to help promote autophagy and mitophagy? And that's fasting. So I know you keep hearing about fasting, and that's because there's a lot of benefit to fasting. We evolved as humans in a time so many thousands of years ago when there was not food aplenty all the time. Wherever you turned around, there was more food. So the human being adapted to times of eating and times of fasting. Well, it turns out that if you fast with water, like just water, or if you do a fasting mimicking diet and you get to the end of day 2 into day 3, that's when the body, of course I'm kind of personalizing this in a way that doesn't really exist, but the body says, okay, day 1, no food. Well, let's just hang in there. Day 2, no food, let's just hang in there. But by the end of day 2 into day 3, the body says, uh-oh, there's no food. So what are we going to do? We're going to rejuvenate our cells. We're going to create autophagy. So think of it like if you watch the Sound of Music. I hope you've seen that movie. And in it, we had the recycling of the drapes. Remember when the nanny who came and was taking care of the kids, and she ended up wanting to make play clothes for the kids. So she recycled the drapes, the old drapes, into play clothes for the kids. So that's what autophagy is, and it's triggered by multi-day fasting. The body takes its old structures and then puts them in the recycle bin, the lysosome, turns back the clock into little individual particles from which they came from, and then reconstructs new cellular components. And mitochondria can do this too. But the cell is lazy. The body is lazy. It won't do mitophagy and it won't do autophagy unless it feels it has to. So if you fast during a 24-hour day, there are definitely benefits. And we'll do another thing just on fasting if you guys are interested. But you will not trigger autophagy unless you do a multi-day water fast or fasting mimicking diet. And autophagy is really important to slow the aging process. Because I mentioned we don't have unlimited stem cells, and we don't have the ability to just at this time, create brand new stem cells out of the air. And there's another thing you may have heard of, and what is it called? Telomeres. So telomeres are like caps on chromosomes, and a cell can only live as long as it has telomeres. And when you have shortened telomeres, and there are some tests that can look at this. This is what I'll lead into, and that is the difference between biological age and chronological age. So telomeres, these little caps on the chromosomes, when they get shorter and shorter, and you have shorter chromosomes, you have shorter telomeres, then what happens? That cell cannot live forever. So the shorter your telomeres is an indication of biological age. So you want to have long telomeres. Now, there have been different companies that have measured telomeres, but my understanding, and I'm not a telomere expert, is that the shortest telomere, just like the weakest link in a chain, is the important one. You can't average telomeres. You have some long ones, you have some short ones, we'll look for the middle. No, it's the shortest. So if you ever get a telomere test, it's the shortest telomeres. Think of it as the weakest link in terms of trying to understand your biological age. So what is this about biological age versus chronological age? You all know your chronological age. How many years have you lived since the day you were born? Biological age is something that can be computed using different mathematical programs and algorithms to try to say, like, for example, say someone is 60 and they say, well, I'm chronologically 60, but I'm biologically 40. I'm like, my body is like 20 years younger than my actual stated age. That would be nice. So how do you even know such a thing? And is it real? Well, maybe sometimes there's something to it, but I don't want you to think that when somebody tells you their biological age is such and such that it's like an absolute science. It is not. So there are different ways. One is looking at telomeres, which I touched on. Another is looking at a whole array of blood and urine biomarkers. So you're looking at markers of inflammation and lipids and nutrients, and they put it all together and they give you an idea. So for example, if you're highly inflamed, you have terrible lipid profile, you have a lot of oxidized cholesterol, you have all these markers, that show inflammation in your arteries, that's not a good sign. So that would be seen as accelerated aging, or certainly not that you're younger than your age, right? If you have all those inflammation markers that are terrible. Now, another way of looking at it is with what they call epigenetic markers. So they're looking at things involving methylation. And this gets pretty complicated. So methylation, these little molecules that are hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and looking at them in relationship to DNA, how they attach to DNA. So you have these epigenetic markers, and you have methylation-related markers, and that is probably pretty scientific, but that you have to go to different companies, and they will compute this out, and it gives you some idea of how your genetic material is doing, and that relates to oxidative stress and damage to the DNA and zombie cells and all those things that we were just talking about. Now, there is also a research that I mentioned out of Stanford that looked at a huge number of molecular and also microbiome markers. So they looked at, oh my gosh, it was like 100 and something thousand different markers involving microbiomes of all the different organs and tissues of the body, and so many different molecules in the blood. It was huge, a huge study looking at all these different markers. And what did they find? This is really interesting. Aging isn't linear. Like we used to think, well, you just age like it's like a steady march, but it isn't. It turns out that there's an acceleration of aging that occurs in the mid-40s and the early 60s. And interestingly, they're saying that it's separate, not related to menopause in women, and that it's in men and women. It's almost like there's a biological clock that's completely separate, unrelated to menopause, that seems to suddenly push a button and you get accelerated aging in your mid-40s, and then again in your another big bump in your early 60s. And this can affect how you metabolize caffeine and alcohol. It can affect issues relating to your skin and your musculoskeletal system, particularly your muscles and your bones, but also your joints. It can affect cardiovascular health, but knowing helps you with doing. So if you're still, at that age or approaching those ages, to know that there's this unexpected, nobody expected to find this accelerated bump in aging that occurs in the mid-40s and the early 60s, when suddenly there's this accelerated aging and deterioration of cellular vitality. So what can you do? What can you do to slow this aging process? Well, some of it we've already touched on. We want to avoid chemical toxicants. We want to reduce stress. We want to promote sleep, fitness, exercise, purpose, love. We want to reduce hopefully the recurrence and the incidence of chronic infections. We want to eat the most healthy plant-focused diet with lots of fiber, lots of polyphenols from all the different plants. We want to have nuts and seeds and ancient grains. By ancient grains, I mean things like buckwheat, quinoa, millet, amaranth, corn on the cob, and white corn is non-GMO. We want to have lots of fluids, herbs, and spices. And of course, purified water. We want to have air purifier, especially if you live in an area that is known for high air pollution. We want to, emphasize quality sleep and fitness and hormone balance. Okay, for men and women, we want to make sure we have optimal thyroid. We want to make sure we have optimal estradiol, progesterone, testosterone. We want to, if necessary, look at our cortisol levels and see where we're at with that. There's a lot that can be done to slow aging. And this is important because this is how you can have a high quality, healthy longevity. So aging is inexorable. But my goal, and I'm sure yours as well, is to become a super ager, to slow this process down, to recognize the landmines that lay ahead of us, take all the aversive maneuvers we can to achieve our goal of healthy longevity. And let me just add, do some fasting. If you are not too thin, you're not pregnant, you don't have a heart rhythm problem, you didn't just have a heart attack, there's some, please check with your own physician to make sure you're a candidate, but trigger autophagy and mitophagy. And one last thing that I almost forgot, there are other drugs out there that may help, but I think they're not quite ready for prime time, like rapamycin and metformin. There's a lot of some good data on it, but there are other ways that you can accomplish a lot of the same things, like fasting, exercise, and eating the right diet, and then you can avoid a pharmaceutical to try to slow aging. We can do it more naturally. That, at least, is my opinion. So healthy longevity is the goal. Here's to it.